Hello there. So I thought that I would make this off the back of the success of that Randy Starr video and begin the process of covering some of the major Jungian themes that underpin this model of psychoanalysis. It's something that people are becoming more and more interested in, and why not? Because Jung's contribution to the human record is, to my mind, invaluable and incredibly fascinating to discover. And even though with this channel at the moment we are predominantly focusing on early human history for our references on art and the early mindset of mankind, I don't think that beginning a treatment on Jungian concepts would be venturing too far afield from that, considering that part of Jung's work tries to tap into the deepest, oldest, unconscious life of our psychological evolution, a life that we can presume was present in our early ancestors, as it still is in us today. So, with that being said, I don't think that it would be appropriate to begin an exercise like this that deals with the life work of a significant man's life without actually finding out what we can say about the man that brought it to us. Jung spent a great deal of his life treating people in therapy and thinking about the inner life of other human beings, and he also forwarded a significant effort trying to access that deep reservoir of unconscious life within himself. So that's really the spirit of what I want to do for you today. I don't want to simply give you some dry biography. I want us to come away with an appreciation of Jung through his major life events, and also how he came to forge his ideas about the mind. And so through understanding the man, we may come to acquire a new insight into the ideas that he gave us. And I'm going to split this up into several stages. First, we're going to look at Jung's early life and his entry into the field. Second, we'll cover the relationship and subsequent split from Sigmund Freud. Thirdly, and this is going to be a really fascinating thing to uncover, his period of self-imposed isolation and his collapse into the imagery of the unconscious. And finally, we're going to cover some of the reasons as to why I think that Carl Jung's work is so vitally important to us today. So, this is my treatment for you on the life and work of the psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung. So let's begin this chronologically, beginning with a reflection upon Carl Jung's early life. He was raised in Switzerland during the late 19th century, the son of a professor of surgery at the University of Basel. And so even from a young age, his mind was going to be saturated within the realm of high ideas. We know from his early accounts that he began to learn Latin by his father's instruction from a very early age, and at night his mother would read to him from an illustrated children's book about exotic religions and depictions of fantastic Hindu gods and things like that, which only activated his burgeoning imagination. So even at this very early stage in Jung's life, we see this immersion with the realms of the Western intellectual tradition on one hand, and this exotic romantic interest of different cultures to begin to enter into his life almost simultaneously. It is this foundational layer forming that will facilitate his maturing appreciation of world culture and also his entry point into the world of academic study. And this fascination with exotica was really galvanized the moment that he came across another book in the library of one of his friend's fathers, I believe, a book on the topic of spiritualistic phenomena. And he began to notice patterns between the accounts in the book concerning various elements of pre-Christian folklore and the modern accounts of religious phenomena in the then Christian world. And he thought that this simply couldn't be a coincidence. He intuited that there had to be a connecting relationship here, something that perhaps sprang from the inside out, that repeated itself over and over again throughout human history. This is one of the intuitions that he was actually having back then. So we see here the first ligaments really begin to form between apparently disassociated bodies in the cultural law, informing his impression that there might be points of connection that speak to something hidden within the human system that continually evokes these impressions into the world. He tried to share this personal intrigue with other people around him, friends and family and the like, but to his surprise, he was usually met with either disinterest or dismissal. Other intelligent minds simply weren't reading into life in the same way that he was at this young age. And he accounted for this when he said, and I quote, "I had the feeling that I had been pushed to the brink of the world. What was of burning interest to me was null and void to others, and even a cause of dread." I think that this early statement from Jung is really interesting because it speaks to something that I've spoken about before on here, about my persuasion that at the very primal level, people are simultaneously intrigued and perturbed by their own mortal existence. And this plays into the fact that many people have a curious apprehension about dealing with matters of the inner life. It's something that we can't escape from, and it's something that touches us so deeply on so many different levels, and yet there is a part of many people's nature that simply doesn't want to look that deep. Perhaps because we're afraid of what we'll find down there. We're afraid that the mask might slip and we'll have to confront something that thwarts the comforting perception that we have of ourselves. I think there might be some truth in that. But for someone like Jung, he simply wasn't forged of that kind of metal. He was a maverick in many ways. There was something about him that was made to break through barriers and cross thresholds and see what was lurking on the other side. And this is definitely the impression that I'm getting of him at this stage. He was a natural introvert for sure, but he had this boldness to follow that light into the darkness and discover the truth that was hidden on the inside. And some people are like that. Many of us are born into a world of blindness and die as an uncompleted truth. But for these pioneers, these mavericks, the blindness of the world can't hold them back from the persuasions that they follow to create the lenses that they will construct to see the world with new eyes and then offer those eyes back to the world so the world can see itself. And I honestly think that had Jung been born in an earlier time, something like, 300-400 years ago, he probably would have become a monk and lived out a life in a monastery. I think that that would have been a perfect place for somebody like him. A place of quiet contemplation, meditation, prayer and reflection, an active, immersive relationship with the inner landscape of the organism, crossing its way to God. But Jung had a very different background. He possessed the inclinations of the mystic and the scientist simultaneously, and that would lend itself to the avenues that he ventured into as his life continued. So let's talk now about Jung's education. He initially began pursuing a path in medicine, following in his father's footsteps, as many people did back in those days. But I think that we've already gathered that linear discipline was never going to hold enough of the kind of person that he was. It was never going to interest him for long. He was also immersing himself in his spare time into the works of Nietzsche, Goethe, and Schopenhauer. But again, when he returned to inspire conversation with many of his friends, he was met with a similar cold rejection that he encountered when he tried to breach the subject of folklore to them. And it was around this period that a series of highly interesting things started to happen in his life. There's this amazing story from this period in his life where he accounted of a time where he was actually out of the house and his mother was sitting by a window sewing, I think, and all of a sudden there was this almighty sound that filled the air, like the sound of a pistol being fired off, and a wooden table that was in the same room split down the middle with no explanation as to why. And then 2 weeks later, a very similar thing happened. He was coming back home one day and found his mother and his sister in this state of distress running around the house. And what happened again was this loud sound, and this time a sideboard containing some items had split. But when he checked inside the sideboard, Jung found a bread knife that had been shattered into multiple tiny fragments. And for the remainder of his days, Jung kept those fragments held in a napkin as a reminder of that moment that taught him that there would always be things in this world that he might not be able to rationally explain. Now, as we've said, he was originally following a course of medicinal study, yeah? But it wasn't long before his eyes fell upon the still quite young discipline of psychiatry. Now, we have to bear in mind that back then, psychiatry was held in a certain degree of contempt by many people in the medicinal discipline, and still is today, albeit for slightly different reasons. Nonetheless, as soon as Jung began to study the psychiatric literature, his mind exploded. For him, it was within this primitive discipline, this early discipline, with its emphasis on what they called the diseases of the personality, that he immediately surrendered to the promise that this was the only way, the only clear offering in the world of academia that held the possibility of reconciling the problem of spiritual and biological worlds. And this is something important to mention here as well. Jung, as I've said, was very well versed in Nietzsche, and a major aspect of what embodies Nietzsche's work was concerning the existential crisis that had befallen the West since the dethronement of the confidence and the certitude of its Christian tradition and the rise of Enlightenment utopianism, which promised to deliver mankind into a promise of rational humanism. And Nietzsche prophesies that this unbridled overconfidence in man's potential to take the place of God on earth would open the gates for the emergence of radical totalitarian systems that, through the attempts to render a new heaven on earth, would actually deliver mankind into a kind of autocratic, mechanistic, totalitarian nightmare scenario that could potentially finish us. And this had a very powerful effect over Jung's mind, and we can at least partially look upon Jung's life work as an attempt to answer Nietzsche's call, to mend the damaged fabric of the Western soul by not so much returning to Christianity per se, but by searching for evidence within the larger body of the world's great spiritual traditions and see if we can discover, see if we can extract the solutions that could lend itself to the healing of this great psycho-spiritual rift that had been instigated through the Enlightenment initiative. And this is still a problem that we are very much facing today. Nietzsche's call still goes unanswered. But anyway, now let's talk about some of the interesting groups that Jung was beginning to make contact with as well. This was a time when seances and mediums were quite the fashion amongst certain quarters of the European populace. And Jung became very interested in these groups, as you might imagine. So he started to attend a few of them whilst he was enrolling in this new venture in the study of psychiatry. And he would go to these meetings and observe what was happening there, partially because he had a genuine interest in such things, but also because he felt that these experiences could lend insight into explaining some of the uncanny phenomenon that had happened at his mother's house concerning the mystery over the splitting items. So he would attend these meetings, and he would take note on every aspect of the activity, ultimately leading towards the creation of his first doctoral dissertation called On the Psychology and Pathology of So-Called Occult Phenomena. And I want to go over this paper now because it highlights some really interesting emerging features in what would later embody the prime characteristics of Jung's major life work. First is the concentration of this phenomenon of somnambulism. This is usually associated with sleepwalking in these days, but it really encompasses any state where there is a temporary shutdown of the primary conscious drives and the appearance of what we would call automatisms, whereby the subject is apparently unconscious, but certain complex motor systems such as waking and navigating and even coherent speech continue to process as if that person was still awake and making strategic conscious decisions. Primary consciousness shuts down, and the emergence of a new, seemingly disassociated sub-personality seems to take over for a while. And this may be interpreted in some circles as spirits entering into the body or past life memories flooding into the dormant mind and taking over the ego consciousness. What's important to note here, though, with reference to Jung's development, is that this was the first real instance where he began to consider the possibility of another, shall we say, intelligence, another field of life that was active beneath the primacy of our waking conscious states. And what's more, he also became convinced that inherent in the human psyche was a patterning force which may throughout various times and places in human history recreate its life through religious models and fantastical systems that could be identified and cross-compared on the basis of their respective similarities, almost like a kind of evolutionary echo that reverberates through time and culture. And I'm going to read another quote from Jung now. He said, "One could almost say that if all the world's traditions were cut off at a single blow, the whole mythology and the whole history of religion would start all over again in the next generation." And we can see some indication of this when we look at the historical record. I always find it so illustrative of the pervading power of these things to reinvoke themselves after long periods of devastation, almost like plants growing back into the fertile soil after the overspill of a volcano. Think about the Slavic world, where they experienced 70 years of state-enforced atheism. One might expect that such a prolonged suppression of religious sentiment over the generations would simply kill it off in the ones that came after. But no, what we actually saw after the collapse of the Soviet Union was this great flourishing of Orthodox Christianity. People were literally starving for religious again. And I think that this complements what Jung was sensing in these days when he wrote his doctoral thesis, that culture and the underlying psychological forces that facilitate it cannot be revoked by artificial measure. They emerge organically from the inside out, not from some top-down autocratic secular institution. They are a part and parcel of what we are from birth. And we do not need to be told to really create these systems. They emerge naturally and fluidly from us because they originate from inside of us. So then, in closing to this chapter on Jung's past, we've learned that Jung's early mind, baptized in the waters of the Western intellectual tradition and the language of the exotic religious imagery, began to intuit a way forward in the young man's life to reconcile the fissure in the Western signal by seeking contact with the phenomena of the human mind and its implications for what it could tell us about the kind of psychological organism that we really are. And it was through this initiation into the likewise young and still developing world of psychiatry where he made contact with the grandfather of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, whose relationship we'll cover in the next segment. So we couldn't really do a treatment on the life of Carl Jung justice without covering his relationship to Sigmund Freud. This relationship had both a constructive and a destructive effect on Jung, as we will discover. But first, let's say something about how the two met with each other and also go over some of the commonalities and differences that they had between them. Freud had only recently published his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, in 1900, when Jung, on the advice of one of his colleagues in the field, he began to read it. The encounter with this book had a significant impact on Jung. He had been working for quite some time on this theory of word association, and also this theory of a feeling tone that acts as a kind of binding agent within the psyche for various sets of separate ideas to be held together in association. You will have some experience of this in your own life, I'm sure. If you search the contents of your own psychological memory, there are certain ideas or concepts or memories that possess a certain ambient effect when they're evoked. It may be a piece of music that relates to a particular time in your life, and when you immerse with the memory of that construct, a familiar mental ambience is associated with it. That's the feeling tone. And these compactions of subject and tone can occupy both the conscious and the unconscious life, colluding together to inform this tonal matrix of your entire psychological life. And as I said, sometimes these tonal phenomena are actually buried unconsciously, and they may come to us through a dream or via some therapeutic technique like hypnosis. However, all we might experience is the tone and not the associated subject that it pertains to, because as I've said, the subject is actually buried within the unconscious. So then it becomes a matter of prolonged therapy work to draw out these tonal ambiences and try to work and find out the subjects that they actually associate to. So returning to Freud's book again, when Jung read it, he was highly intrigued with Freud's mechanism of repression theory, because he thought that it offered the best explanation to support his work on word association and these tonal emanations. However, Jung did have some problems with the justifications that Freud offered for these phenomena, this phenomena of repression, that being the libido and sexual trauma. Jung found that Freud's overemphasis on sexuality to be non-congruent with his findings that many other factors often play into the justification for suppressed material, such as prestige, guilt, wealth, and so on. So to sublimate all of these factors beneath a sexual hypothesis was, to Jung's mind, overstretching the mark just a bit.
And I sent the book to Freud and wrote to him about my association experiments and how they confirmed his theory thus far.
Yes.
And that is how it began, my friendship with Freud began.
Yes. Now, one of the first very fundamental ideas in the original psychoanalytic theory was Freud's conception of the libido as sort of a broad psychic sexual energy.
Well, you see, in the beginning, I had naturally certain prejudices against his conceptions. And after a while, I overcame them. I could do that from owing to my biological training.
Yes.
And I could not deny the importance of the sexual instinct, you know.
Yes.
But later on, I saw that it was very one-sided. Because, you see, man is not only governed by the sex instinct, there are other instincts as well. For instance, in biology, you see, the nutritional instinct is just as important as the sex instinct. Also, in primitive societies, sexuality plays a role much smaller than food. Food is the all-important interest and desire.
Yeah.
Sex, that is something they can have everywhere. They are not shy. But the food is difficult to obtain, you see?
Yes, yes.
And so it is the main interest.
Yes.
And then in other societies, for instance, in civilized societies, the power drive plays a much greater role than sex.
Yes.
For instance, there are many big businessmen who are impotent, even, because their whole energy is going into money-making. Now, this is something that goes parallel now with the whole school of the Salpêtrière in Paris. There was Pierre Janet, who has worked out that side of the unconscious reactions quite particularly.
Yes.
Now, Freud refers very little to Pierre Janet.
No,
Well,
I
have studied with Pierre Janet in Paris,
yes.
and he has formed my ideas very much. He was a first-class observer, though he had no dynamic theory about, no psychological theory.
Yes.
It was a sort of physiological theory
Yes.
Of the unconscious phenomena as a so-called abaissement du niveau mental.
Yes.
That means a certain depotentiation of the tension of consciousness.
Yes.
It sinks below the level of consciousness, and thus becomes unconscious.
Yes.
Now, that is Freud's view too.
Yes.
Only he says it sinks down because it is helped, it is repressed
Yes.
from above.
Yes. Yes.
Then that was my first point of difference with Freud.
Yes.
I say there are cases, in my observation, where there was no repression from above, but the thing itself withdrew.
Yes.
Those contents that became unconscious had withdrawn all by themselves.
Yes.
They were not repressed.
Yes.
On the contrary.
Yes.
Nonetheless, despite some of the gripes that Freud had with, despite some of the gripes that Jung had with Freud's justifications rather than his initial observations, Jung was highly inspired by the book, and he began to send letters to Freud detailing the accounts of his experiments with word association. Freud read them and responded in kind, leading to an eventual first meeting with the two in Vienna, where Freud was based. It's commonly cited that when the two men met for the first time, they proceeded to hold a conversation that lasted for 13 hours straight. It was a very important next step in Jung's professional development, and it cemented their relationship as colleagues in a familiar field, and I guess you could say friends. The next time they met, though, again at Freud's residence in Vienna, Jung brought his wife along with him, and he also met with Freud's wife. And whilst they were having dinner, Freud tried to breach the conversation about psychoanalysis and talk to his wife about it. And he was very surprised to realize that Freud's wife didn't really know anything about his professional work whatsoever. And Jung and his wife could really tell that there was a definite distance and a coldness in the relationship that they had together. This gets even more interesting, though. In the same event, in the second meeting, Jung also met with Freud's wife's younger sister, and she knew everything about Freud's work, absolutely everything about it. And she even went to Jung and confided in him at this time that basically she and Freud were having an affair, and she felt incredibly guilty about it. So that was one of the first interesting things that actually came up, and Jung obviously didn't say anything to Freud about this. They kept it as a secret between themselves. Now, a year later, Freud and Jung met at the First International Congress of Psychoanalysis. So everybody at this stage had come very far, and their field was expanding and widening its scope. And Freud is said to have embraced Jung at this event and said that he almost adopted Jung as his eldest son, anointing him as the successor and crown prince of his legacy. Now then, what proceeded to happen marked the first real rift between them. Jung, the newly appointed crown prince, asked Freud what his thoughts were on matters of parapsychology, to which Freud utterly dismissed it as, sheer nonsense. Remember, Freud was trying to build up the reputation of psychoanalysis into a legitimate science, and so he was understandably quite concerned about, shall we say, occult influences creeping in to damage the image of his beloved project. This, to my mind, is quite understandable considering the reputation of such things in the common culture, but we also have to take into account here something very distinctive between the two men in regards to their personal driving forces. Freud was an academic for sure, but he was a very dry academic, and he possessed that acrid pessimism that sometimes accompanies the really hard sciences. Even though Freud wasn't himself working in a hard science domain, he was still very much preoccupied with being seen as reputable as one working in a field like biology and chemistry. He wanted to make a name for himself. He wanted to become known by everybody as the godfather of psychoanalysis and write his name into the history books, and he was not going to let some young maverick upstart with an interest in exotica thwart that ascent to personal glory. Jung, on the other hand, wasn't really concerned with the accolades. He was a simple devotee of insight, and he wasn't deterred about looking into any and all areas that could potentially elucidate what he was looking for, regardless of the bloody cultural acceptability. He wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing this for the knowledge, and he was trying to find a knowledge that could potentially heal the rift in mankind that he was very concerned about through reading Nietzsche. Now, during this conflict, something really interesting happened. Halfway through this conversation, Jung said that he started to feel this burning sensation in his throat begin to appear, and it grew and it grew and it grew really intensely until it felt like he had a piece of hot iron in his throat, and then suddenly there was this enormous crack emanating directly from Freud's bookcase. It was so massive that they both startled as if the damn thing was going to fall over on top of them. Jung suggested to Freud that here was the evidence of the phenomena that he was talking about, and Freud again told him it was absolute nonsense. What are you talking about? But Jung persisted and told Freud that in a moment's time there would be another loud crack coming from the bookcase, and immediately after he uttered the last word, bang, there again there was this enormous great sound coming from the bookcase again. Well, Freud and Jung didn't really know what to make of it, and Jung said that Freud just stood there, staring at him in a moment of shock and utter disbelief. But from the expression on Freud's face, Jung sensed that he had now begun to mistrust him a bit, and that their relationship was never going to be the same again. And he wasn't wrong. Subsequently to this event, the two travelled to America's Clark University, where they were going to receive their honorary degrees. And Jung had been reading about the recent discovery of the peat bog corpses in Denmark that dated all the way back to the Iron Age, I think. And whenever he began to talk about this with Freud, Freud would always respond with irritation, as if something unspoken was bothering him. And it was. It was only later, when they were having dinner, that Freud suddenly collapsed and fainted, conceiving the idea that Jung had begun to have death wishes against him. So this was getting to be a highly bizarre relationship, even by psychoanalyst standards. And they both began a process at this point of using their knowledge to study each other's dreams.
Tell me, did Freud himself ever analyze you?
Oh yes, I submitted quite a lot of my dreams to him, and so did he.
And he to you, yes?
Oh yes,
yes.
yes.
Do you remember now, at this distance of time, what were the significant features of Freud's dreams that you noted at the time?
Well, that is rather indiscreet to ask. You know, there is such a thing as a professional secret.
He's been dead these many years.
Yes, but these regards last longer than life.
And so let's explore Freud's dream, shall we? Freud had a dream about a triangle. Now, based on some of the private matters in Freud's life, does this immediately throw up any signals to you? It does, right? He was visualizing the relationship between his wife, her sister, and himself, but realized that Freud had no idea that Jung knew about the affair. So Jung just asked him to try and access some of the personal relations that might have to this dream, to which Freud looked at him with scorn, and he said that he could tell him, but he would not risk his reputation. It was clear that the father of psychoanalysis was troubled about his many relationships, both at work and at home. Freud later returned to Jung and tried to persuade him of the absolute integrity of his psychosexual theory, claiming that it was essential for Jung to accept it as pure dogma. He also suggested to Jung that he should start going to church. And when Jung asked why, he simply said, to act as a bulwark. To which Jung asked, when he asked what this bulwark was meant to protect him from, Freud simply replied, against the black tide of occultism. So the relationship between these two figures of the psychoanalytic field continued for a while longer, but according to Jung's accounts, Freud started to harbour more paranoid fantasies about him, viewing him and Jung's personal work as a deliberate resistance against his, as a wish, as Freud put it, to destroy the father. Jung tried to no avail to reassure him, but every time that he did that, it was always met with more bitterness and rejection. This rejection ultimately leading to a further distancing of the two men, and it was this departure that Jung began to embark upon his major life's work, not as a pupil, not as an enemy, but as a true maverick of the human mind. Everything that we have been speaking about thus far has been characterized by the nature of a preliminary metamorphosis, an embryonic stage, shall we say, that is setting the foundations for the true flourishing of intellectual and creative life to spill forth. Jung's education up to this point, and most significantly his departure from the authority of the father, released Jung's mind, I think, into a new potential chapter of self-discovery and personal adventure. These were the years where the identity of his own personal models of psychoanalysis really came into being, and that's what we're going to be looking at now. It was in these years that Jung really began investigating seriously into the language and imagery of that material that had captured his imagination as a child, that of the mythological and spiritual record of all mankind, Hindu, Egyptian, Gnostic, Teutonic, Native American, any and all material that he could find pertaining to these topics. And why this is important to Jung's development is because he started to notice patterns between the character of these mythological tracts and the subject matter of the fantasies and dreams of his patients. And once this association was made, a flood of internal imagery started to become released in his mind, and so he began to write ravenously about them. He said, "It was the explosion of all those psychic contents which could find no room, no breathing space in the constricting atmosphere of Freudian psychology and its narrow outlook."
Man is born with a certain functioning, a certain way of functioning, a certain pattern of behavior, and that is expressed in the form of archetypal images, of archetypal forms. For instance, the way in which a man should behave is given by an archetype. Yeah. And therefore, you see, the primitives tell such stories. A great deal of education goes through storytelling.
Yes.
For instance, they call in a palaver of the young men, and two older men perform before the eyes of the younger all the things they should not do. Yeah. And at the end they say, now that is exactly the thing you shall not do. Another way is they tell them of all the things they should not do.
Yeah.
None you should, like the Decalogue. Yeah. Thou shalt not.
Yes, yes.
And that is always supported by mythological tales.
Yes.
For instance, our ancestors have done so and so, and so you shall do.
Yes.
Or such a hero has done so and so,
yes.
And that is your model.
Yes.
For instance, take the teaching of the Catholic Church. There are several thousand saints,
yes.
And they show us how, you see,
the models then become the
models, yeah.
for the individual.
And they have their legends, and that is Christian mythology.
Yes.
In Greek, you know, there was a Theseus, there was a Heracles, models of fine men, of gentlemen, you know.
Yes, yes.
And they teach us how to behave. They are archetypes.
I see.
Archetypes of behavior.
An old resonance was brewing in Jung that spoke to the nature of his original endeavour to answer Nietzsche's call, that of the existential rift that had been summoned after the displacement of Christianity in the Western tradition. After this treatment, Jung began to comprehend what it truly meant to live with myths and what it truly meant to live without them. He'd already grasped that the Enlightenment ideal, with all of its vainglorious promises of secular humanistic grandeur, had failed, utterly failed, to provide the Western psyche with even close to the same generative foundations as those systems that it had sought to replace. But now he was maturing in his appreciation of what exactly had been lost and why we needed to recapture it again. And I want to read to you this wonderful passage by a church father, nonetheless, from the book The Portable Jung. Myth is what is believed always, everywhere, and by everybody. Hence the man who thinks he can live without myth or outside it is an exception. He is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life which continues within him, or yet with contemporary human society. This plaything of his reason never grips his vitals. It may occasionally be heavy on his stomach, for that organ is apt to reject the products of reason as indigestible. The psyche is not of today. Its ancestry goes back millions of years. Individual consciousness is but the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth, and it would find itself in better accord with the truth if it took the existence of the rhizome into its calculations, for the root matter is the mother of all things. And I think that that is such a wonderful and powerful testament to the problems that Jung was trying to grapple with. And importantly for us listening to this, the problems that we in the West are still trying to deal with today. The human organism has spent centuries cultivating and germinating the products of its own life force through myth, religion, philosophy, tradition, art, and so on. And these have provided the psychological container that has carried and motivated the human signal throughout millennia. They are a part of our psychological system as much as our organic system, like our lungs or our heart or the blood that rushes throughout our body. They are the psycho-spiritual organs of the human psyche. And our modern cultural program since the Enlightenment has been trying to disassociate these things away from their primary core in the life of the body and of the psyche. And it attempts to trivialize these things down to the level of arbitrary circumstance in the attempt, I think, to try and neutralize some of the negative consequences that sometimes spawn from an unhealthy relationship with these systems. But I think that this secular initiative completely misses the point that the primary issue is our relationship to them and how those respective systems are successful in playing a complementary role in the generative aspects of our nature and what they can do to mitigate the darker aspects of our human nature. Because man unbridled is not enough. He needs guidance. He needs a code with which to organize himself to the world of action and the world of forms within himself. And without that, no manner of reason or appeal to scientific authority can remediate the powers that lie inside of him. And they will make their way into the world with or without them anyway. The question is, how are we going to attend to that? Are we simply going to abandon the traditional wisdom of the ages and live under the misguided presumption that we're good enough as we are? Or are we going to make the real effort to understand what we are, warts and all, through the living traditions and through the myths that have been provided to mankind as an aid in his development? Do we want to live in a state of alienation from what we are, with no ligament to support or guide us? Or do we want to truly engage with the products of our psychological organism in a healthy, mature, and deep way? Because whatever your stance is with these religious or mythological systems, they provided that for thousands of years, up until the industrial project sought to divorce us from its ligament and bring us into the fold of a new legion of self-appointed experts and political initiatives that would seek to parasitize on man's potential and use it from his own advancement at the expense of ours. These systems are a part of what we are, and we cannot live without them for long without crashing into a state of alienation from our own psyche that demands reconciliation and integration with its components. To live with a myth is to live with ligament, because it roots you to what you are, not what you think you are, not what you believe you are, what you are in primacy, what you are as an emanation of those prior people and natural forces that have preceded you. And I think that Carl Jung really grasped this. He really did, because as he became more familiarized with this mythological language, something started to happen within him. The imagery of his own psychic nature began to emanate from his own systems, almost like a conversation was happening between the myths and the imagery of Jung's own psyche. That's a good way of rendering it. And as Jung started to perceive this happening, it spoke to something very profound in him, namely how important it was for him to come to terms with the psychological imagery of his own unconscious life and reconcile with that if he was going to have any hope whatsoever of being any real benefit to the people that he was trying to treat in his clinical practice or through his work. And I think that this speaks to such an important missing ingredient in the education of many young psychologists and therapists today, that we can't expect to merely understand the mind through the intellect and remembering concepts. It's essential for us to harness that education and forward it towards the illumination of our own psychological life, if we are to in any way to be able to effectively empathize with the respective dynamics of personalities in a professional practice. To use the language of that church father again, when Jung finally comprehended the significance of a mythological education, he understood the importance of understanding that rhizome from which he sprang, of what unconscious myths were speaking directly to his nature. And this is something that the American scholar Joseph Campbell articulated as well. He implored people to discover what myths they live by. And through that, we become rooted like plants to the unconscious substrates that inform and direct our behavior. It was from this period of life that Jung developed one of the models that he's most known for, that of archetypes. And corresponding to what we've already said with regards to reoccurring patterns of characteristic imagery in mythic history and in the language of dreams and fantasies, we can address this directly. Archetypes in Jung's discipline are part of the building blocks of the human psyche. They exist within us, separate from any external social or personal experiences, and they are not brought into the human system from the outside in. They emerge into the world from the inside out because they are part of the human psyche's formation from birth. They are, like I said before, the underlying anatomy of the human mind. They're a part of that. And they are a part of us, just like our physical organs are. And like organs, they possess their own innate characteristics. And this is why we see the same narrative and mythic motifs spring up over and over and over again in the creative records of artists and cultures all over the world who have not undergone any transference of cultural influence with each other.
Now, see, the archetype is a force, it has an autonomy. It can suddenly seize you. It is like a seizure.
Yeah.
So, for instance, falling in love at first sight, that is such a case. You see, you have a certain image in yourself without knowing it of the woman, of the woman.
Yeah.
Now you see that girl, or at least a good imitation of your type.
Yeah.
And instantly you get a seizure and you're gone.
Yeah.
And afterwards you may discover that it was a hell of a mistake. Or you see, a man is quite capable, he's intelligent enough to see that that woman of his choice, as one says, not no choice, he has been captured.
Yeah.
You know, he sees that she is no good at all, that she is a hell of a business. And he tells me so, and he said, for God's sake, doctor, help me to get rid of that woman. He can't. He's like clay in her fingers. And that is the archetype.
I must also say this to clear up a common misconception about archetypes. Despite the fact that archetypes often reveal themselves in images, archetypes are not themselves images. They are a part of the underlying substructure of the human psyche, and their characteristic code maps onto common representations of imagery, sound, and symbol that act as their skin, you might say. We could look at my hand now and ask, what is the structure that defines the hand? It's not the hand itself, which we can see before us, but it's the underlying skeleton that we do not see because it is encased in the flesh that maps over it. And archetypes work in a very similar way. The imagery is not the archetype, but the skin jacket that the archetype comes in. Jung also reasoned that when a departure is made from the norms of our species, such as when a neurosis or a dream or any state that perturbs our psychic equilibrium, then we will see a release of such imagery emerge in the consciousness from the unconscious reservoir from where they actually sprang. And Jung thought that the better way to interpret these phenomena wasn't through their relation to suppressed material in the Freudian sense, but to expand them further as they relate to the visual codifications of world myth as a reflection of their original source in the psyche. And what I now want to talk to you about is a stage in Jung's life where he made contact with this imagery within himself in a very, very profound way. So Jung was really beginning to flesh out his conceptions, and he had expanded the psychoanalytic model as presented by Sigmund Freud into this much wider encompassing architecture of pan-cultural mythology and spirituality. he was reading into the human condition, I think, in a very visual way. And it's hardly surprising that Jung's work is so popular amongst creative types, because it is a highly imagistic way of talking about the human condition. And it's imagery that we are going to be focusing on in this segment, because we are reaching a stage in Jung's life where he entered into a highly difficult yet highly transformative stage in the development of his work and his relationship to his own inner life. Almost as a prophetic sign of Nietzsche's warning to humanity, World War I had broke out in Europe, and between that major event and the encroach of World War II, this represented the highest stage of Jung's maturation. Themes of breakdown and transformation were typifying this period of European history, and on a microcosmic scale, it certainly represented what was happening in Jung's life as well. His renunciation of Freud's psychosexual dogma made him the target of a severe and brutal character assassination at the hands of many of his former contemporaries, which only served to draw Jung deeper into his own isolation and studies. We could say that a line had been severed from the old world of Jung's life, and he would now begin to enter into a new world of internal landscapes and private reservoirs of internal imagery. And it was during this period of intense introspective activity that Jung was reminded of his childhood, where he used to enjoy building miniature towns and castles. And when he took this activity up again, he created a complex for himself on the banks of Lake Zurich, a miniature castle with 4 towers, which he said would make a representation in stone of his innermost thoughts. And he spent several months of the year in the tower, living a life of base simplicity, without electricity or any of the mod cons and luxuries that the modern world could provide, reducing life down to the most simple and essential of tasks needed for existence to continue. The rest of the time he was committed to thinking, to reading, and recording the impressions of his vivid, very, very much active inner life. He had made a new world for himself, you could say, a world created for nothing but simple existence and raw contemplation, a monastery of sorts, certainly. This was a way, I think, for Jung to truly begin to live in a world of symbols, to fully engage with the material that had provoked and guided the trajectory of his own life's path. Jung is justifiably regarded very much for his brilliant writing, but he always spoke and thought in the language of imagery. And if you read any of his major works, or some works from some of the Jungians that came after him, the writing is so image-laden, it's overwhelming. And I think that this speaks directly to the metamorphosis that we've been covering here. Jung obviously possessed a highly inquisitive and wondrous imagination as a youth, but I see this merely as the cellular growth of an inevitable process that would only spread and get stronger as he got older. Some people are born into what they become, and I think that Jung could never have really existed properly in the atmosphere of academia or a clinic forever. The imagery brought him to that place and helped him forge him into the man that he became. It was a two-way process, of course. I'm not taking away from the efforts that Jung put into these things at all. What I'm saying is that this life tract was inevitably going to manifest in one way or another, because it was the byproduct of not only what he became, but I think what he always was. And I find it so interesting how this memory of childhood activity produced out of an emanation from his unconscious would provoke him to reconnect with that old activity again as a grown man and create this new world for himself in the new environment that would then catalyze the deepening of that imagistic relationship to begin. And to say something personally, this is something that I can very much give testament to in my own fashion, because there have been several periods in my life over the recent years when I was developing XELASOMA where I would go on these little pilgrimages to old places where I used to go as a youth. And these were years when I was also working heavily with meditation and trying to harness that to explore my own internal mindscape in the same environment where my young mind had originally been incubated in. There's a lot of truth to this observation that when a deliberate effort is made to make contact with the internal impressions that arise in introspective activity, it galvanizes that process of image release in the body. And I found that when I would come home and I would begin to codify the received material, even more imagery and narratives would spill through, and some of that imagery has become embodied in projects that are yet to be released down the line. So there was this conversation going on between Jung and his own internal imagery, and he began to codify that through writing and creativity. Now, Jung, like many of us, would initially interpret a lot of these things under the umbrella of art, as most of us would, but he also had a very different perspective on them. He saw these created images that he was making as being much more than attractive designs. He interpreted them, and I really like this phrase, as being like X-rays of his own psychological state. So it was partially here where he committed to mind some of the major essays and books that account for his view on the human condition and the cultural condition. Certainly, I think that Jung's contribution applies itself positively not only to psychology, but also to culture, because Jung was using culture and art as a mirror, a microscope into the anatomy of the human mind. He wanted to understand the language of this internal imagery. He wanted to understand what it could mean, not just for his life, but for the entire life of mankind, whose own psychological systems were producing this kind of imagery as well. Jung believed that the true aim of one's life was not to suppress or repress the imagery of one's soul, but to discover its original source and identity, to truly know one's other side, to become individuated, and in that process commit to that great invitation inscribed above the chamber of the oracle at Delphi. Man, know thyself, and you will know the universe and its gods. So we've really covered a lot of ground with this, and it was a real task trying to isolate which parts of Jung's life I wanted to include and what other aspects would have to be left out, because there's so much that you can say. I mean, we're not only dealing with somebody's life here, we're also trying to deal with somebody's life work, so it's always going to be very difficult to try and encapsulate it all. And I will say that this won't be the last time that we speak about Carl Jung on this channel. His life work is totally applicable to many of the kind of things that we discuss regularly on here. And to go further than that, I think that his work is very important to where we are now in history. I did say that I didn't want to make this a dry biography, because there are already things like that out there already. And what's more, I don't think that that kind of analysis really captures the mind and the spirit of a man like Jung. So in a certain way, I think that it was appropriate that an artist should provide the rendering of a man who intuitively thought and felt his way around the world using images in an imagistic language. I wanted to make this video to give a primer to some of the major events that informed Jung's progression. That much is true. But I also wanted to give context to people about why an interest in his ideas might be important. Because Jung devoted his life energy not only to the mind, but also to the soul of mankind. A psyche that he rightfully intuited was in desperate need of repair. We've brought up Nietzsche quite a few times throughout this treatment, and for quite good reason, because he was a prophet for some of the things that transpired in the 20th century, and by the looks of things, I don't think that we can confidently say that we have somehow released ourselves from the tensions that contributed to some of those darker events. Jung was living in a time when Europe was negotiating its position to the fracture that had taken place in the aftermath of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. It was a time where there was not only an adventurous new spirit driving forward new discoveries in science and artistic innovation and the like, but there was definitely a burgeoning neurosis creeping in that I levy, like Jung's metamorphosis to become a depth psychologist, would only have to satisfy itself one way or another. It was inevitably going to come to something major somewhere down the line, and it did, and we've got the historical testimony to give accounts to that.
During the 1930s, when you were working a lot with German patients, you did, I believe, forecast that a Second World War was very likely. Well, now, looking at the world today, do you feel that a Third World War is likely?
I have no definite indications in that respect. But there are so many indications that one doesn't know what one sees. Is it trees or is it the wood? It's very difficult to say, because the dreams of people's dreams contain apprehensions, you know. But it is very difficult to say whether they point to a war, because that idea is uppermost in people's mind. Formerly, you know, it has been much simpler. People didn't think of a war. And therefore, it was rather clear what the dreams meant. Nowadays, no more so. We are so full of apprehensions, fears, that one doesn't know exactly to what it points. One thing is sure, a great change of our psychological attitude is imminent. That is certain.
Why?
Because we need more. We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. And so when you think in a certain way, you may feel considerably better. And I think if you think along the lines of nature, then you think properly.
And
He knew that a complex and sensitive creature like a human can't merely exist as a quanta in some rationalized system of economic exchanges and materialistic indulgence. We need more than that. We need a locus. We need a common system of living imagery, a narrative to constellate the complexity and address the sensitivity that we hold within us. Because if you strip that out of a man's life and simply say, hey, now you're free, be rational, that's not going to lead him anywhere but into a state of alienation from his deep resonances. We are not simply rational animals, as the Enlightenment ideologues would have us be. We're much deeper than that. We're much more sophisticated than that, and we possess a dynamic ecosystem of sometimes contradictory and uncanny influences, and all of those things demand a reconciliation that lies beyond the grasp of reason alone. Man needs imagery. He needs narratives. He needs his myths. And sometimes he needs to intertwine with aspects of his life that are on the face of things quite irrational, and yet within them possess a generative and constructive influence over him. And we're still coming to terms and trying to work out what exactly that can be done about that. But it has to be done. Nietzsche's call cannot go unanswered. And we need to listen to people like Carl Jung, because he recognized and respected this complex dynamism of the human condition. Jung, like Nietzsche, knew the consequences of leaving man in an unaddressed state, and he spent his entire adult life trying to uncover new pathways, new possibilities from within the tangled web of culture and world history, to try and restore what had been lost to this emancipating initiative of modernity. We are biological organisms with psychological ecosystems, and if those areas are not addressed using the full measure and power of our own cultural systems and intelligent systems, we will find deficiency where we could have discovered the promise of a better potential. We need to address the entire dynamic of what we are, warts and all. We need to encompass the entirety of our psychological landscape. We can't simply apply the laws of the desert to the laws of the ocean simply because it's convenient to our modernistic pretenses. We have to be honest and mature about what we are, and out of that we will create the systems that return back into us and fertilize the soils and the rhizomes from which they and we spring. We can't exist in a vacuum forever. We can't wallow in this facile, adolescent no man's land forever. Because that's not our true nature to live like that. And it's not our true nature because it doesn't belong anywhere in nature. It can't exist in nature. And we are the products of natural systems. So if we design new artificial systems that only speak to the parts that are convenient to the parts and not the whole, our general system will deteriorate. The state of living that we have selected for ourselves in the aftermath of the Second Great World War has brought us many luxuries, that's true. But it's ultimately unsustainable. It can only exist within an impermanent life support system. And as we see all around us, that life support system is failing. The life support system is malfunctioning all around us. So if the support systems that facilitate this empty indulgence in the self, which is apathetic to the soul, what's going to happen when that system that supports you breaks down? What's going to happen to a legion of rootless cosmopolitans when it finally comes to consciousness that we possess no self-sufficiency, no inner stabilizing core. When we finally come to realize, oh yeah, all of those backwards, archaic, mumbo-jumbo Sky Daddy mythologies that I've been antagonistic to all of my life, maybe they were actually created for a good reason after all. Maybe they did actually possess something that could be instructive to me. Maybe I should have listened to something, anything, but my own selfishness and arrogance. We need to heal the rift that has been made in us through our selfishness and through our unwillingness to accommodate the sophistication of our psychological ecosystems. And on a positive note, I believe that is going to happen, because I already see it happening. I see people who are awakening to the realization that this cosmopolitan corruption cannot provide them with what the human spirit requires to survive. And they see that in many ways. Certain aspects of its feature is deliberately antagonistic towards the maturation of a healthy human life. Because the world that we find ourselves in doesn't give a damn for what Jung wanted for us. Because that's not complementary to the absoluteness of their industrial and economic initiatives. They only want our bodies. Our souls can simply be left to rot. And yeah, people are realizing this now more than ever. And they're trying to take the initiative to align themselves to new ideas and new behaviors and new systems of living that complement the organic maturation of their time spent on this planet. Many people don't want to be rootless cosmopolitans. They want to answer the call of their own life's quest that's emanating from within their system and that's been telling them for years and years and years that the way of life that we have chosen for ourselves is not working out very well up here. And it's not doing so well in here. And I want this introduction to the life of Carl Jung to serve as another initiation into that process of self-transformation, because I think that there is going to be a great resurgence of interest in Jung in the coming years, at least in familiar pathways to the things that he was talking about at the very least, because he provided a certain framework for exactly the kind of metamorphosis that the West needs at the moment to heal. And like I've said many times before, the darkness of the world is not going to do that for us. We have to seize the initiative and start facing up to the darkness within ourselves, illuminating that inner territory for the betterment of our own lives and the greater life of our culture. Carl Jung passed away on June the 6th, 1961, and he left behind a grand legacy of illuminating material for us to invest with and capture the same kind of vivid and instructive and generative relationship that he discovered through an engagement with his own inner contents. Jung is one of the only people in the West who have taken seriously the demands of Nietzsche's warning to the European man and set to task with the endeavour to heal the plight within the Western psyche. And this is the most important thing here. Jung didn't provide us with all of the answers. He wasn't trying to create some new religion or develop some all-encompassing system that would give us all of the solutions on a silver platter. No. Jung wasn't going to provide us with all of the answers. He was providing us with an invitation, a very in-depth and instructive and demanding invitation, but still an invitation nonetheless. Because he knew that the new solutions were not going to come from some top-down model. It had to come from the inside out. And that was his challenge to us. Discover what you truly are in the darkest territories of your inner landscape that you can possibly find. And out of that darkness, you will realize the true contents of your own nature. And out of that, you will potentially become what you are. And I think that this challenge is absolutely vital for us to succeed in, for the success of our projects, for the success of our relationships, for the success of our countries, for the success of our souls. Definitely for the success of our souls. So that's been my treatment on the life of the great man Carl Gustav Jung. I hope that you've really enjoyed this. It's been an absolute pleasure to make this, and like I said, we're going to be talking a lot more about his life work as time goes on. So yeah, thank you very much for listening again, and as usual, I will see you again.